Can you tell me 3 specific items you learned from your last interview training? My best guess is you can't. You may have never even received interview training in your career. So what's happening? The people who are going to be critical to the success of the business are being determined by people that either can't remember anything they were trained on or were not trained at all. Yikes, this is a big deal. So let's dive in. Once the right mindset has been created, the audit has been completed, your ATS is looking good, it's time to start training and retraining employees. And if you missed any of these other previous videos, I'm going to attach them as cards up above. So the best place to start with interview training is mindset. For better or worse, interviewing is still a critical part of the process in hiring the best people. And to create consistent hiring outcomes, the importance of interview training needs to have the backing of leadership, and the importance needs to be communicated down from the leadership team. The leadership team also needs to attend these trainings. That includes executives, the CEO, the president, etc. Because when leadership is attending these trainings along with other employees, this is the nonverbal communication. We believe in this training, we believe in hiring, we believe in interviewing. So let's start with some basics. We need to just quickly address some of the admin and logistics items. And I don't want to bore you with these details, but to get every current employee trained, it's critical to figure out, can everybody be trained at the same time, or do the trainings need to be broken up? And what is the preference, in person or virtual? I strongly recommend virtual. How do we clear everybody's schedules to make it happen? And the first time around, I would really recommend just training as many people as possible, and anyone who misses the training will be added to future trainings that are conducted as part of onboarding, because now that hiring is a priority for your organization, every new employee who joins is going to receive interview training in their first week of onboarding. Lastly, logistics-wise, a professional trainer should be hired with multiple people who have volunteered or been identified to shadow, so that they can train future employees and you don't always have to hire an outside consultant to do the training. The other component, small component to consider, is customization. Your audit should have provided some good data, and ideally this customization data will be incorporated into the training, but it would need enough ahead of time for the schedule to be shared with the trainer so that they could implement some of this customization into their training. So let's get into it. What needs to be addressed in this training to have it be successful? Going right back to mindset. Yes, we already talked about this item, I get it. Let's just dive in for a second. And it's worth noting that this part of the training should not be delivered by the consultant, but should be delivered by the CEO or president of the organization. To simply state one more time, this is a shift in prioritization. We are taking hiring seriously. We want you to take this training seriously, and this will be tied to performance. At least that's my strong recommendation. I think if interviewing is not tied to performance, your organization will simply never hire the best talent. But either way, doubling down on the overall mindset is going to be absolutely a critical starting point. Now, let's hand it over to the trainer. And the best place to start and couple directly with mindset is candidate experience. I don't want to spend a long time on this item because it's really simple. The better the candidate experience, the more likely the candidate is to join your organization. So like many of these initial data points, the goal is awareness. That is a missing item from interview training. Simply training employees on how to conduct interviews is not enough. Every candidate needs to have a positive and great experience every single time with every interviewer. Next, let's build another awareness item: unconscious bias. The interview training should define what unconscious bias is and back it up with examples and case studies that show the negative impact of unconscious bias and how it can lead to unfair hiring decisions. And by focusing in on this item first, it's another awareness tool. We're bringing more awareness in and will help foster the right mindset for employees during the rest of the training. It will also confirm why it's so important to have structured interviews by using the same interview questions and scorecards for all candidates going after the same role. And lastly, these best practices will be confirmed throughout the training. Next, body language. Similar to unconscious bias, the goal is to train interviewers on this foundational critical item first. Many people aren't aware that most of our communication is nonverbal. Estimates go up to about 90% of our communication is nonverbal. So it should provide just a little bit of upfront coaching about the interviewer's body language. Do they have positive body language? Are they doing things like smiling, having good eye contact, good posture, good hand movements, energy, etc.? And then thinking about it from the candidate perspective, looking for these items in them. Same thing with pitch and tone. Statistically speaking, our body language and pitch and tone make up the vast majority of how we communicate. The actual words make up very little, but we want to just make sure that interviewers are looking for a few items in regards to pitch and tone. That can be things like clarity, pace is really important, professionalism is really important, politeness, etc. The third critical item to discuss before we get into the weeds of training, this is a really fun one, is the interviewer's physical setup. Have you ever considered on how getting this simple item right will get more interviewers comfortable with conducting an interview? Because interviewers don't really know how to set up their screenings in a meaningful way, and this sounds ridiculous, but if you were to ask all your employees, what's the ideal physical setup? How are you setting up your screen for a video interview? Most employees would have a wide range of answers. So there's really just 4 items to be considering. We gotta have on our screen the video of the other person, interview notes, our interview scorecard, and some form of digital timer. And just getting this right is going to be an easy step, but an important step. And this will be part of the role play later on to teach interviewers how to manage all this data at one time and practice it again in the role play. So now let's dive into the interview training that's going to actually get our interviewers into the interview. And let's start with the warm-up. This is hands down one of the biggest missed opportunities that's not being shared or coached on in interview training. And to hire the best candidates, the warm-up is critical. Interviews are stressful. There's tons of stress and anxiety for the candidate, and not creating an environment of warmth and comfort, you're strongly just increasing the likelihood that you're not going to get the best version of that person on their interview day. And so companies miss out on hiring the best people because they don't give this nice warm-up. So while this part of the training will be short, it's critical. And working on the script and messaging, this will be built into the process. So this goes really early on. This starts before the interview. This will be part of having the recruiter verbally explain the organization's hiring philosophy and maybe potentially sharing videos before the interview even starts to back up this approach. But let's dive into a few items that should be trained on. When an interviewer hops onto that video and meets the candidate in person, they should start with a warm greeting always. Nice to meet you, how are you today? So then after this mandatory warm-up, it should be followed by an acknowledgement. Something like, I know interviews can be stressful, so I'm here to guide you through the interview if needed. This includes stopping if you need a moment and asking if I can help you. I want to get the best version of you throughout the interview. I'll be asking you follow-up questions. This is to benefit you. It allows you to tell more about what you did and how you approach things, giving me more insight to you and how you're a fit for the role and organization. And lastly, after I ask a question, make sure to restate it and clarify it if needed. And feel free to take your time before answering questions. We find that candidates provide better answers when they take a moment to gather their thoughts. This warm-up should sound very familiar and very consistent and may be down to a specific script that you give. Candidates need to have this same warm-up experience from every interviewer to create a great candidate experience. So let's go to the second part of the warm-up. This part's really basic. Sometimes asking 1 to 2 warm-up questions can be a good gauge of a candidate's level of preparation. Common warm-up questions are tell me about yourself, why this company, etc. I recommend no more than 2 of these questions. Otherwise, you're just wasting interview time. I also recommend a little bit of a verbal setup on these questions. I'm going to ask you a couple warm-up questions. Spend about a minute. I'm going to time these answers. If you go over a couple minutes, I'm going to kindly interrupt you just so you can keep the interview moving forward. Now, let's dive into some of the core components of the training. The next is understanding 3 of the most important foundational items to look for in candidates' answers. And those 3 foundational items are structure, organization, and detail. I often refer to this as SOD. The key to any great interview answer typically requires these 3 items, and it's so critical for interviewers because they've never been trained typically on the high-level components that make up a good answer. And all 3 of these items will help interviewers determine just a number of items about candidates, including but not limited to how do they communicate, what's their thought process, what's their level of preparation, how professional are they competent, do they have good problem solving, critical thinking skills, are they thorough, are they precise, and just do they have an overall knowledge in the role-related areas that are necessary to be successful in the position. So with structure, are they prepared and do they have a plan in place? And structure could simply be using the STAR method for behavioral questions or using the CFAS method for open-ended / hypothetical questions. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about both of those areas in a moment. But with this training, interviewers should be able to quickly assess within a few seconds whether they are utilizing a defined structure or method or just winging it. Next is organization and training interviewers on how the candidate organizes the information. For example, do they organize information in ways that are very easy to understand? Do they follow some sort of chronological order or organize the information in a way that when they're sharing the information, it actually answers the question and is easy to follow along? Is that information concise and easy to understand throughout? And lastly, the most difficult part for candidates is providing the right level of detail. So interviewers should be trained on a few specific items pertaining to these details. Are the details they provided clear? Are the details specific? Is their impact clear? Is their approach clear? Are they a storyteller or a doer? Do they provide generic information that anyone could provide, or do they show strong related role knowledge, role depth, etc.? So let's dive into these items in a little bit more detail now. But these are the 3 major components that make up any great interview answer. So let's dive in starting on the behavioral side of things. Across the globe, at any and all companies, these are the most common types of interview questions. Questions that start with something like, tell me about a time when, give me an example of. It starts with understanding why. These questions are so important because past performance is often a great indicator of future performance. And so what I want to do is let's break this down into 4 sections by understanding the fundamentals and what to look for in each aspect of the most common way to answer a behavioral question, and that's the STAR method. Specifically, STAR stands for situation, task, actions, and results. And again, this is the most popular method for answering these types of questions, but other methods you might hear the candidate using are CAR, that's context, action result, PAR, problem action result, SOAR, situation obstacle action result, SAR, situation action reflection. And what are the themes? All the themes have a setup, ask for that context, what were the actions, and then some form of results and learnings. And so before breaking down in these core areas, let's discuss a few fundamentals that interviewers should be focused in on the behavioral side. It starts with something I like to call the pivot point. Is the candidate able to identify the pivot point? Specifically when answering the question, are they focusing in on the actions they took to answer the question, or are they just providing a lot of additional non-relevant information and context? Relevancy and making sure they've answered the question is going to be an important part of training for interviewers. Next is visuals. This is kind of the second foundational item. Any great behavioral answer is going to involve great visuals and paint a clear picture because that's going to give the interviewer insight and a good vision of how that person's going to be successful in the role. And it's just a key communication skill to be able to provide specific visuals when communicating information. Lastly, did they just tell a story, or did they tell a story that was driven through action? Oftentimes, interviewers can get overly impressed with answers that are a good story. But the question every interviewer should constantly be asking themselves, and a big part for behavioral interviewing, is how did the candidate contribute to the success of the overall project, program, initiative, communication, etc.? In all cases, this is going to be 3 fundamental areas that will help interviewers determine if candidates are providing strong answers. Let's start with the setup, which is the situation and task. The interview training should focus in on a few key areas. Did the candidate identify themselves, state their role and company, and provide any additional context if needed? Were they able to quickly being the key word here, detail any relevant people, processes, technologies, and challenges? And then did they set the stage for the rest of their answer? This is really the task part. Did they say how they contributed and the timeline of how long it took to get it done? Candidates should be able to do this in about 30 seconds. And they won't. Interviewers will be trained on how to utilize a digital stopwatch on their computer or phone to see how much time the candidate spent setting up the story. Because commonly candidates will spend all the time on context and not a lot of time telling the interviewer what they did. Next is the actions. This is hands down the most important part of any candidate's behavioral answer. Interviewers want to constantly be asking themselves a number of different questions and items when candidates provide their actions. So interviewers need to be trained and noticed, are candidates actually answering the question asked? Specifically, do their actions support the answer to the question? Secondly, training on how to distinguish actions as opposed to storytelling. And this is very straightforward. Is it clear what the candidate did and how they did it? That's action-oriented, that's not storytelling. And almost all answers should include the same items. Usually, it starts with research and conversations. So interviewers should get a good visual for what the candidate researched and how they went about it and who they spoke to and what was the focus of those conversations. A critical data point here that will be a part of the training is that many candidates will spend all their time on the setup and not talk about anything else. So just a key item to be looking out for. But a great candidate will move on to the next step of talking about what they tested and how they executed. Execution is typically where candidates spend most of their time in the real world, but in interviews it's often skipped over. So it's something to really focus in on. And then lastly, rounding out the actions is typically some sort of launching, presenting, documenting. This is how most people finalize what they do when they have a successful project or program, etc. And it's another common misstep. Oftentimes, the actual actions to close out the example are not brought all together, something that interviewers will be trained to look out for. Last is the results. And this is a common misstep, and one of the most common missteps is no results. Candidates will just kind of end their answer. And so a critical item to train interviewers on is simply if they go to the end and don't provide results, interviewers will prompt simply, and what were the results? Because this again creates a good warm experience for the candidate and will allow them to dive into those results. So a few key items that interviewers should be looking for during the results section are, does that first result actually answer the question? Are they driving towards a result that's connected back to what was being asked of them? Then, do they quantify their results with numbers? Remember, numbers are the universal language. And then, lastly, repeatability. Do they bring in any repeatability? By winning that client, did they win 10 more clients? By creating that process, were they able to socialize and document that new process to help the entire organization? They should really be focused in on the bigger win. The best candidates will share the bigger win. The last item that sometimes you'll hear from candidates is learnings. And it's just an important item for interviewers to look out for. Typically, great candidates are sharing learnings. It's not always critical, but Oftentimes, people who have that self-awareness will make better employees. So, the second big part of interview training is always going to be asking follow-up questions. And there are 3 great questions to use when looking at behavioral questions, especially in this interview training. So first is to dive deeper into the details that were provided by asking, can you tell me a little bit more about X? Or can you explain Y to me in a little bit more detail? This is simply probing on the information that's already been provided. Then we go back to the what's and how's, this time in the form of questions, such as, well, can you tell me a little bit more about what you did after X? Can you tell me specifically how you contributed to Y? And basically, it's using an old technique of repeating the last few words a candidate says. Now, that could be in an exchange or from notes you've taken, and this will be significantly practiced during the role play, but it's really important to probe because, again, this will get the best version of that candidate on their interview day. Let's flip. So let's go over to open-ended / hypothetical questions. I'll call them one or the other as we're talking through this section. The validity of these types of questions in a job interview actually has been debated. But in my opinion, a candidate's ability to problem solve and navigate ambiguity during the interview are good indicators of how they'll perform on the job. And this is why the warm-up is so important, coupled with follow-up questions. We're going to constantly be taking this approach of trying to get the best out of the candidate because that will help them have success. So similar to behavioral questions, a good answer to an open-ended hypothetical question typically includes 4 sections using the CFAS method. Specifically, CFAS stands for Clarify, Framework, Assumptions, Solution. I created this method to help candidates put a structure to answering these types of questions, but most candidates will not be familiar with this structure, with this methodology, like they are with the STAR method on the behavioral side. So the foundational items of making sure to ask questions, creating a good strategy and approach, making role-specific assumptions, and providing depth and specificity in their answers, even if they don't follow CFAS, are all really, really important. Similar to the behavioral approach, let's discuss a few fundamental areas before diving into each one of those facets. And let's start with visuals. It's really important that interviewers are trained on discerning if candidates are solving generically or they're solving like they're in the role. Meaning, could anyone provide those details, or would they need expertise in their specific space to provide that type of answer? Oftentimes I hear generic answers from my clients and I'll tell them, hey, I could give that answer, let's get more specific. Next is transitions. Does the answer feel like one jumbled mess, or does the candidate know how to clearly transition from one concept to the next? Do they build in space for their interviewers to be part of the conversation when answering these questions? These questions are complex, so their ability to break it into pieces and make it a little bit more of an interaction is going to tell you a lot about their communication skills. Lastly is time. For these questions, interviewers will be trained on how to just help candidates manage their time, again, with the use of something like a digital stopwatch. Most candidates really struggle with these types of questions. So the probing and follow-up questions asked by the interviewer will be super important for this part of the training. And we're briefly going to start by covering what interviewers should be looking for and then double down on these follow-up questions. It starts with the setup. So the setup on this side is clarification. The interview training should focus in on a few key areas. Did the candidate take the time to identify any key ambiguities in the question by clarifying any words that had ambiguity, any overall missing data, and ideally, did they ask yes or no questions, because those are data-driven questions, especially in an interview. Next is the framework. Did the candidate bring any structure or organization to their answer, specifically by maybe briefly revealing concepts they'd want to focus in on to solve the problem? And were these concepts connected to the core question being asked of them? And then do they start by not trying to solve for everything, but maybe identifying one key area that they know is going to be critical to having success in the role, as opposed to throwing out some concepts and just generically solving for those concepts? This is where, again, we're going to come back as interviewers and probe and be trained on how to probe. Assumptions. Does the candidate take the time to confirm and restate any details that were provided during clarification? And then do they start to speak from the perspective of the role by highlighting maybe a key person, process, or technology that gets them to give a role-specific answer? So what I mean by that is if they're going after a sales role and they know it's going to be enterprise clients in the retail space, are they bringing that assumption into their answer, or are they just solving for generic sales? Lastly is the solution. Most interviewers should really only expect this part because most candidates don't think through it, and they're typically just going to give one answer and solve for everything in one shot. But in this section, interviewers really need to be looking for depth and really the specific details, again, that are role specific. So let's dive into those follow-up questions and how to really probe for hypothetical questions. This is going to be a little bit more formulaic than behavioral questions, so let's walk through the probing. When a candidate completes their answer, interviewers will be trained on how to walk them back through the questions, through the steps of their answer, starting with clarification. Now that the interviewer has heard their answer, they should use this type of approach by saying, I'm going to restate the question. After restating, tell me what is unclear about the question. What data would you like to have before diving into your answer? Next will be the framework. The interviewer should ask the candidate, if you could go back and answer this question, what would you identify as the 3, 4, 5, etc. most important items to focus in on when answering this question? Then we can help the candidate with their assumptions. The interviewer should be trained on how to get more specific details by saying, now I want you to imagine that you're in this position. What are some assumptions you might make? And then I want you to pick one of those concepts you just mentioned to me, and let's dive just a little bit deeper into that one item. And what this specific method of follow-up does is it allows the interviewer to still determine a candidate's ability to problem solve and navigate ambiguity with a little bit of direction. Because on the job, we're not going to have all the answers, but usually we'll have a little bit of information, whereas with these open-ended questions, sometimes they literally are working from nothing. Secondly, and similar to the behavioral side, interviewers will be trained on how to probe by asking, can you tell me a little bit more about X, or can you explain Y to me? What would you do after X? How would you contribute to Y? And lastly, success measurements. Training interviewers to probe more on metrics on the open-ended side. How does the candidate track success? How would they know if they were successful? And after this, again, we'll go right into role play. So let's quickly address a few other types of questions. Depending on the needs of the organization, let's start and just kind of highlight one of the most common, which is a straightforward role-specific question. That could be a coding question for an engineer or system design question for an engineer. It could be a product question for a product manager, but it's typically a question that has a clear answer. Similar steps should be considered sometimes, like did the candidate clarify, did they take a structured and organized approach, and did they provide that right level of detail? But these types of questions should be asked only by experts on the team. They know what good code looks like, they know the critical steps of a product launch, etc. And of course, follow-up questions would be included for these types of questions as well. Now, there's a number of other questions that could be asked in an interview, from case studies, there might be presentation interviews, and this is all a part of the training that could be customized, but for the purposes of this video, I just wanted to focus in on behavioral and hypothetical questions. Lastly, interviewers need to be trained on what cannot be asked. And this part of the training is going to be very short, but also critical. Interviewers need to be trained on questions that have anything to do with age, race, marital status, gender, sexual orientation, political beliefs, religious affiliations, are discriminatory. Questions about pregnancy or children also can't ask. You can't ask about their arrest record. You can't ask about proof of citizenship, immigration, anything financial like credit ratings. These are all items that just cannot be mentioned, and it does need to be included in the interview. In the interview training, it's just absolutely paramount that these questions aren't being asked. let's just take one moment to get back to role playing, because it's unlikely that most employees will go back to an environment that's 100% on site with in-person interviews. I do like a virtual training where interviewers are role playing via video. This allows them to get that physical setup right, do it all via video, and ideally, they're even recording the role play so they can watch it back and learn from it. The other missing piece of the puzzle is role-playing cannot be a small component. Role-playing should be hours of this training. There should be a lot of back and forth, switch partners, hiring managers working with individual contributors, leaders working with individual contributors, whatever the setup might be. The interview training is not going to be great if we practice one behavioral question and one hypothetical question and then expect interviewers to be good at doing those items in a real interview. Okay. Now that we've put it all together, let's move on to creating that great hiring culture.